All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. Some housekeeping for today. There are closed captions available. If you click on the CC at the bottom, those should be popping up for you as people speak. And feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If you do that, you'll want to change it so that it says panelists and attendees so everyone can see your introduction. And then if you do have questions today, put those in the Q&A. So we'll try to address those during the webinar. And if we don't get to them, we will be sending out a follow-up email and we can answer some of those questions. And then this webinar is being recorded, so you will receive a copy and you can share that with anyone who you think may find value in this information. And the last thing I'll say for housekeeping is that this webinar is not considered a substitute for legal advice. So I'll get started by introducing our panelists today, and it is such a treat to be speaking with these awesome people and get their expertise. They all have different kinds of experience, so I think it'll be really fun. And we're really going to dive into some interesting topics today around recruitment. So starting out, we have Amelia Badua. She holds a BA in communications and began her career as an administrative assistant with a background in sales. Now she works as an HR generalist for First Team. And in this role, she handles full cycle recruiting, onboarding, and supports staff through the employee life cycle. She's also currently studying for her professional in human resources certification. Next, we have Irene Potsakis. She's a human resources business partner at Edelman, which is a global marketing and communications firm. She has her master's degree in leadership and organizational studies, where she did her thesis on the impact of employee onboarding on retention. In addition to roles as an HRBP, Irene has worked in talent acquisition. And then we have Whitney Martin, who is a self-professed data nerd with a master's degree in human resources measurement and evaluation. Through her company, Proactive Consulting, she specializes in helping companies leverage assessment and survey tools to get reliable, actionable data around their people. She has authored several book chapters and articles, including one for the Harvard Business Review. So she's spoken at several national HR conferences, including SHRM National and SHRM Talent Management this fall. And then I'm Jocelyn Thompson, your moderator. I'm the founder and CEO of WorkVision Consulting, a boutique HR consulting company focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. WorkVision Consulting helps companies create DE&I strategies through audits, training, employee engagement surveys, and more. If you're interested in a discovery call, you can email info@workvisionconsulting.com to set that up. And as I mentioned at the beginning, for anyone who has joined us since, there are closed captions available. So you can click on the CC to get those. And this will also be recorded, so you'll receive a copy by the end of the week. If you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. So let's dive right into these questions. I think we have some really fun ones to discuss, and then I'm looking forward to seeing any of the audience questions. But my first question is for Whitney, and it has to do with hiring practices. What hiring practices do you find are the most predictive and least predictive as far as showing candidate success once they become an employee? And can you talk a little bit about how we determine the validity and reliability of that information?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of my favorite things to talk about because it's really counterintuitive, I think, to what most organizations are doing. And so if you think about some of the criteria that we tend to use when we're screening candidates, so many times we look at college degree, we look at past relevant experience, we may do some sort of personality assessment. And there is ample data to show that those are some of the least predictive measures. In other words, the statistical correlation between those things and how somebody ultimately performs on the job is just really low. We're talking like 0.2 and below, whereas 1 would be a perfect correlation. And that is actually based on 100 years worth of workplace productivity research that was done by some researchers named Schmidt and Hunter. And it's kind of the Bible of selection research academic literature, if you will. So anytime you're reading research literature, it's probably going to reference this, this data by these two researchers. That's really been their expertise. And so you know, there's some really fascinating evidence as to why things like college degree and past experience really don't end up correlating with ultimate job performance. But you know, I think it really speaks to kind of why sometimes organizations find that they have a really hard time getting the right people, is because we're relying on a set of predictors that maybe isn't as accurate as it could be. So certainly there are others that are more predictive, things like mental ability, integrity and values, and just kind of a much more strategic way of bringing objective data into the hiring process that's really tightly aligned with what is ultimately going to make the biggest difference for success on the job, which is going to be unique to each organization and in each role.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that information. Next, I want to jump into talking about hiring discrimination and adverse impact. And for our audience, if you don't know, adverse impact refers to employment practices that appear neutral but have a discriminatory effect on protected group. And so I want to ask the panel, and I'll start with Amelia. What practices have you seen in hiring processes that cause hiring discrimination and adverse impact for certain groups? And then a little bit of a follow-up to that is, how do we fix this?
All right, great question. So there's a couple of things that I would say have an adverse impact. As a recruiter, I know I was taught to look at the industry from which the potential candidate is coming from. So I think by only looking at an industry instead of the overall experience first, that can cause an adverse impact. Same with education. I know that Whitney just spoke on education. I know some companies prefer to have education from certain colleges, or, you know, if you went to an online school, that's looked at as not as valuable as if you went to an Ivy League or some other school. And the problem with those two is certain industries have certain demographics. So if you're only looking for candidates from a certain industry, tech is really known for doing this, not to throw them under the bus. So if you look at an industry like tech, where it's dominated by males, specifically white males, and then Asians after, you're already discrediting and not looking at other candidates. And same with education, right? You could be leaving out stay-at-home parents who had to go back to school. You could be leaving out military. You could be leaving out just so many other represented groups from focusing on those two things. So what I think us as recruiters, what we can do is look at more of the transferable skills instead of the industry per se. I know that kind of goes against Whitney's experience, but if we are using experience and we haven't made it to looking at like the mental ability yet, if we're still using kind of that old school measure, you can at least kind of disregard the industry and look at what transfers over instead. And then also consider things outside of college, like, does this person teach themselves how to code and now they do freelance work and they have a whole website that shows kind of what their portfolio looks like? I think those are two solutions to help with that.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much. Irene, I'll go to you if you have anything to add.
I think, removing the education requirement completely is one way that we can bring in more diverse candidates. I just think that access to education is, more limited, and, being available for everyone to apply regardless of their education status. And as Whitney has said, mental ability, values really demonstrate how someone can perform in a job rather than those old school practices. So removing, again, that education requirement would really, open up. And just to lead into more of what Amelia said was, you know, the source of where you're finding your candidates. I think there's a lot more resources than just job boards and your, you know, inbound application system. I think it's important for organizations to look at professional associations. I think just the network within each professional association, many a times they have you know, affinities for, you know, specific ethnic groups. So I think it's important to build those relationships. They're the ones who are going to keep your pipeline, you know, good and lush. So you want to, again, build those relationships where you'll find that candidate who's going to fill that role, and be ambitious to be successful and, you know, be motivated to keep, you know, productivity up.
Awesome. And Whitney, anything to add to what the ladies already said?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think, you know, some of those things like the industry, the experience, the education are not tied to future success. And so exactly as they were saying, what can we measure that speaks more to aptitude and ability as opposed to these you know, proxies, which is a really good word. You know, a lot of times we're trying to get at something that we know is important. And I can't say this enough is, you know, a place where the most bias creeps in is going to be the interview. And so, you know, really trying to pull in some additional objective data to really triangulate the perceptions you're getting there. I've worked with really slick, progressive organizations, and you know, the HR people might be fantastic, but when you get to talking to some of the hiring managers in the departments, they don't understand why they can't ask, what's your favorite movie and why? Or if you were going to be an ice cream flavor, what would it be? I mean, they will fight us tooth and nail because they think there's value there. And what they're really trying to find out is, you know, some answers to some questions about values, or you know, some things that maybe matter, but they're getting at it in a way that infuses so much bias, it's crazy. And so, you know, really trying to help organizations think about what really matters for this job, what's going to differentiate, and then are there some reliable ways we can measure that, that are really going to be more objective and not infuse that bias is huge.
Awesome. Thank you for all that great information. The next question I want to ask is also to everyone on the panel, and that is, what is one step that you think companies can take to make hiring more equitable? And I'll start with Irene.
I feel that the training behind how we hire, what that process looks like for the hiring managers internally. I think having that process ironed out, steel clad, done, so that once you start that process, nothing changes. You know, that way there's consistency with every candidate, and that those hiring managers know what the expectation is for their end, right? What are they looking for? What are they asking? Let's go over those questions that you're asking, because I want to make sure that, you know, like Whitney, you spoke about, I want to make sure that your questions are not just legal, but that they're going to get to what you are exactly looking for. And a lot of hiring managers like to wing it and, oh, here's our, you know, our pool of interviewers, but nobody ever talks to each other about what aspect they are going to focus on. And I think having a plan prior is very important to keeping that process equitable.
Definitely. Thanks. Amelia, what are your thoughts about this?
I think to go to what Irene said, I think that is the first step, making so once you're overhead, everyone is on the same page with that, and actually it's at the front of their minds and not necessarily like an annoyance. I think that's the first important part. I would also challenge organizations to expand their reach and build more of a diverse network. I know that we love to hire referrals, right? Like most recruiters, if they get a referral, but the problem is if every recruiter in your network looks like you, they belong to the same demographic, the same background, the same sex, and all these other categories, more than likely the people that they're going to be referring in is going to mirror that. So I would challenge companies to start looking at building a diverse network to pull from as well, and then start building those cross relationships between the different groups, and then explore outreach as a part of your recruiting process.
Awesome, thanks. Whitney, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I absolutely agree there. And so like a lot of the times what I'm helping organizations with is how to select the best from your applicant pool. But if that applicant pool isn't the right pool, then there's only so much we can do. And so, yes, absolutely agree that, you know, that getting that right is foundational. And then, I'm just always going to harp on the more objective data points we can pull in, the more data points we have to make a good decision, the better the decision is going to be. And so it's really about just kind of having more than just that one or two things that interviews organizations tend to rely on. So we're not making decisions just on interviews or just on reference checks or past experience, but we really have that wealth of good, diverse data points to pull from to help us make better decisions.
Awesome. And I do have an audience question, and it's for Amelia. So I'll pop that in here. It says, I agree that transferable skills are the best indicator of fit, but what are ways you can push back on a client or hiring manager when they ask for specific industry experience or education requirements? Thoughts on that, Amelia?
I'm the type of person to question, right? So if this were me, or again, that, I want this particular education, I'd ask them why. Like, why do you think a person would be better for this from this? So I would get down to the why they want that, or why someone from a non-traditional background could easily fit that mold. Now, that's my style of doing things. I like to question things first to fully understand why. Like, are you saying that this person needs 5 years? Like, what do you expect a person to know in 5 years? Or what do you expect for them to have accomplished within 5 years? And if I can make an argument for why a candidate could have done it in 2 or 3, then I'll push back in that way. So that's my tactic in doing that. I would try it out if I were you. Of course, use grace. Don't be too mean about it, but yes.
Awesome. And I do think, I see we have another audience question, but I'm going to go on to one of our questions because I think it sort of addresses this idea of, what are we looking for when we're looking for qualifications of applicants? So I'll ask that question and then I'll jump back to the audience question. So this next question is about core competencies, which are also known as core qualifications. And with these, I want to see where our panelists have seen these used, what their experiences are with them, and the thoughts about how they maybe strengthen the hiring process. So Irene, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think, again, going back to that hiring manager and drilling down, what are they looking for and what will make someone successful in this role, right? So going back to those transferable skills, I think, it's important to address what the goal of the position is. Like, is it a technical position where they have to have specific software experience or like accounting type technical processes, or is this a position where it's more strategic? Are they needing to show their experience in how they've worked with teams to develop and execute on a specific plan? But again, asking those very specific questions about like, what is the day-to-day? How does this person accomplish what they need to accomplish? Who do they work with? And how do we ensure that that particular part of their job gets accomplished? We really want to drill down to those things because ultimately, it's not based on industry experience. It's not based on that college education. Yes, it's important and it adds value, but again, I think being able to be specific in what they're looking for will only create those core competencies for that person.
I would love to jump in, Jocelyn, if that's okay. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that this is foundational, right? I mean, you can't select the right person until you know what you're selecting for. And I feel like so many organizations really don't do their due diligence in that piece of it. So I went into, just as an example, a small family-owned manufacturing organization. They were doing like 4 different kinds of mechanical aptitude tests for candidates. I mean, some simulation stuff. I mean, some really nice stuff. They developed it well. And so when I got into the organization and started talking to like the manufacturing supervisors and asking, well, when somebody doesn't work out in this role, why do they not work out? It was never mechanical aptitude. It was, that they didn't show enough initiative, or they weren't a team player, or, blah, blah, blah. And so, it's really about understanding what are those key differentiators that we need to select for, and then how can we reliably measure that? Another example, I went into another manufacturing organization, and they were having candidates deal out playing cards as fast as they could as a screening thing to see if they had enough manual dexterity to do the job. There was no blackjack table out there on the production floor. So, I quickly put a stop to this. Like, no, this is not a reliable way, to do that. But, is manual dexterity important? Quite possibly. But we need to really first identify what are those key things, and then figure out how can we measure those in a way that's fair and equitable and predictive and actually correlated with ultimate success on the job.
Definitely. And Amelia, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I obviously agree with both of them. The other thing I noticed when we are having the managers tell us what they, as far as like the core competencies, I always kind of push back to say, okay, what is it that they need to know versus what you think is nice to know? So what's on your wish list, right? Because I feel like a lot of them have like the perfect candidate, and I feel like sometimes there's no one that is going to meet that, versus what can we train? So I think having that distinction as well, even if they don't have all of the core competencies per se, are they trainable? And then do they have some of those soft skills that will complement their hard skills that they're bringing to the table? But I think that managers will not always look at it that way, especially with me. I'm speaking from someone who's newer into the HR realm, and I've noticed that sometimes they don't get that pushback from other HR leaders. So I think it's our job to kind of push back on the core competencies to figure that out.
Yeah, I think you're so right about the training piece. I just remember when I was trying to transfer into HR, and I got this response from recruiters of, well, I don't think you know how to schedule a meeting in Outlook. And, having these little things that someone hasn't done before that you could train them in 2 minutes, and, not selecting a candidate for that reason is really short-sighted. So I definitely agree. The next question comes from an attendee, and it's, can you speak on the importance of a diverse hiring committee? And let's start with Whitney, and then I'll go to Irene and then Amelia.
I would love to actually hear what Irene and Amelia have to say about this, because I'm usually further back in the process,
Sure.
but I would love to, hear their experience on this.
Perfect. Irene,
yeah, excuse me. I think the hiring committee definitely should be addressed at the forefront of the process. When you're talking about hiring manager, it's who do you want on the committee? And a lot of times they'll, oh, I want my partner and I want the person that they're talking to in the other department. Well, do those people also look like you? We want to make sure that our hiring committee is representative of the population in the company. We want to make sure that we have different backgrounds interviewing, and maybe a person on the committee doesn't have an interaction on that particular person's, job process. But I think it's important to, engage them so that they can bring a different perspective to the table. And it is hard to do. It's harder to do in tech, right? But I think being able to set that committee up ahead of time, again, make it consistent with each candidate, will bring that process to be, as close to equitable as possible, just given, the resources that a lot of companies now have.
Awesome. Amelia, what are your thoughts?
I think it's critical, especially now. I think 2020 was a huge eye opener for a lot of organizations. And I know, and I'm speaking generally, I know a lot of, and the generations that come look at your website, and they're going to see who's doing the hiring. They're going to look at who your board of directors are. And if they do not see diversity there, a lot of candidates, great candidates, aren't even going to want to bother with you. That's how important it is. I also think it holds us all accountable, right? And I know we'll probably end up talking about this at a different point during the call, but like I mentioned earlier, when you are a referral-based company or you love referrals and you're bringing in people that look like you, that can have an adverse impact. But if you have 10 different recruiters from 10 different backgrounds bringing in 10 different people, and then you guys can all look at it objectively and see the strengths in each person that's different from whatever reason, I feel like that helps the hiring process to be more equitable as well.
And Whitney, I'm curious if you have additional thoughts after hearing what they have to say. If not, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And I think just having a clarity of vision among all of those people about what they're looking for. You know, one of the challenges I've seen is when you get a bunch of different people on that team and you ask each of them separately, what kinds of things are you really looking for in this candidate? They might have a completely different list from each other. So just really creating that, that consistency of vision there, I think is important.
Yeah, awesome. And then, you know, I guess to follow up, I feel like you all touched on this a little bit, but what would you say to a hiring manager that says, well, I only have these people, they all look the same, they all come from the same demographic as far as who's able to do interviews and who's trained and all of that stuff? What would be your tactic there? Irene, do you want to go first again? That?
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, Amelia touched on this, you know, ask why these specific people and what makes them the best, you know, judge for this particular position. Let's find somebody else. Let's bring in somebody from a different department who has even just an outsider's perception of what this person does on the day-to-day. Just bringing in that diverse voice and having someone who has a different perspective is so important. And you know, it's gonna break that mold that a lot of hiring managers tend to stay in. They feel comfortable in their bubble. So you know, let's break the bubble.
Definitely. Any other thoughts, Amelia?
Yes, I respectfully. Obviously, I'm not shy, so but I would say respectfully. You know, that forward-thinking company, if that's what we really value, if we really value diversity, right? Because a lot of companies are saying that now. So I would just use those words like, hey, if this is the company of who we are, then why not explore these other areas? And keep in mind, like I said earlier, a lot of candidates are not even bothering with companies that are not putting this at the front. And that can end up messing up your candidate pool altogether, right? So I would look at end up affecting your bottom line if you're only looking at certain people for certain positions and people are going on your website and we're starting to notice a pattern. I think that it could do more damage than good, in my opinion.
Definitely. Any thoughts on that, Whitney, before we move to the next question? Nope. Okay. So next I want to talk about the Rooney Rule. So this is a rule that's in the NFL, and it's named after the late Dan Rooney, who's a former owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers and chairperson of the NFL's Diversity Committee. And the Rooney Rule is an NFL policy that requires teams to interview an ethnic minority candidate for head coaching and senior football operations positions. And so I've heard this talked about in the tech sector and described as having both at least one non-male candidate and one non-white candidate interview for every role. And I'm curious if the panel has seen this used, or even if you haven't, like what you think about it. Is it an effective tool for increasing diversity within an organization? And we'll start with Whitney.
I saw Amelia raise her hand. I think she should go.
Yeah, Amelia.
This is a hot button.
Okay, so I don't obviously know what you guys are going to say, but in my opinion, no, I think a tool is only as good as the person who yields it. So I think that even if you have those processes in place, if the person who's making the hiring decision or the group making the hiring decision has a particular person in their head, it doesn't really matter what you bring in front of them if at the end of the day, they know that they want to hire a white female or a Black female. So I think it goes back to what they're truly looking for, and having them open to looking for other things. But that's just my opinion, my experience.
Yeah, I go back and forth. I mean, we do this on our end. We have our diversity initiatives, and we've talked about this in the last few weeks, just even in my role. Let's make sure we interview underrepresented groups. Let's make sure that the source in which they come from is diverse. Again, I'm a heavy proponent on professional associations, but what are you going to do with that person when they're in the company? I think it's also important to have a strategy around retention and engagement. Is there sponsorship? Do they have a mentorship program? What are the resources and access to the rest of the company that they'll have? Because even for someone like myself, who's first generation college graduate, I had to navigate the career world on my own. I was fortunate enough to have, an older sister who, started that trek for me ahead of me. But at the same time, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I didn't know that networking was so important. And for someone who doesn't have that exposure, or just even that someone to nudge them to say, make sure you meet the CEO, make sure you say hi to everybody that you meet in the company, regardless of their title, regardless of what they do. People don't know what they don't know. So I think the engagement strategy and retention are just as important as the recruiting strategy. Otherwise, your turnover becomes out of control, and it doesn't help your diversity initiatives if you're not retaining the right folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what both of you said. I will just chime in with my experience of doing this. And in a very small capacity, I was hiring 7 people for a sales team, and made sure that for every single role I hired for, there was a non-white candidate and a non-male candidate. And I definitely saw the number increase as far as who we were hiring compared to what the team looked like before I did that. And so I found it to be really successful, but I completely agree that once they get in there, and if the culture is not set up for success, it's not going to have a long-term lasting impact. So any other thoughts on that? Okay. So the next question that I wanted to ask, and I'll direct this one to Irene and then see if anyone else has thoughts as well, is what are your thoughts on using homework projects as part of the hiring process? And what kinds of projects do you think are acceptable, and how much time should a candidate spend? This is something we see a lot in tech, but even as an HR candidate, I've been asked to do homework projects. So I'm curious to hear what you think about it.
Again, it's one of those, it depends on the company. It depends on what you're asking the candidate, and it goes back to the why, right? Whitney is very big on the why. Why are we doing this? What are we measuring? And if you have that in place, and you know what that assignment looks like and how it's going to measure that person's success in the role specifically, then it could work. Where it doesn't work is that you're saying, oh, I've got this problem internally. Let's just have the candidates, work on this homework assignment to see if they can be successful, because most of the time it's free work, let's be real. And we have to be very careful, especially in California, for having somebody work when they're not a part of the company, all these compliance. That's another day's session. But I think companies need to be very careful about the assignments that they're asking, and what is it measuring, and even just the access to getting it completed, right? So we want to make sure that it's equitable even in the project itself.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I've been asked to do homework assignments that were free work for sure.
Yeah, I think we all have, and we just, nope, maybe this isn't the company for me, but thanks.
Yeah. What other thoughts, Amelia or Whitney, do you have any thoughts on this to add?
I can speak a little bit to that, because, it's a similar question to having candidates fill out assessments, which is my that's my world, where I almost exclusively live, is really those kind of instruments that we might administer as part of the selection process. And I get asked that question a lot about, what's appropriate, how much time should we ask candidates to spend, where in the process does it make the most sense? And all of those answers are going to be, it depends. It depends on the level of job you're hiring for. It depends on what your applicant pool looks like. If you are the kind of company that gets 1,000 applicants for a role, what you can do looks a lot different than a company who gets 3 applicants for a role. And, I think it all is going to come down to communicating that why, communicating how this is going to fit in the process. Because if you do a good job of that, I mean, you think about how much time we spend researching buying a car, right? We test drive these cars, we do the consumer reports, we do all this. Shouldn't a candidate want to do as much research about the company that they are going to spend half of their life, their days with? And so if you really start to think about it in terms of, why are we using these tools? And it's really a mutually beneficial thing, and really do a good job of communicating that, both parties are usually willing to put in, and make that investment to see if it's a mutual fit. But it's always going to come down to, are we measuring the right things? Are we communicating it well? And is it all feel like a congruent system?
Yeah, thank you. Amelia, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
I have not had to do any of these homework assignments, nor have our company has not required it. Now, I have heard of companies that do them. From the candidates I see, they don't like to do it, right? Because they see it as work. I've seen, a lot of terrible reviews as far as companies will go through all of the interview process. The candidate will spend 3 hours on the project or 2 hours on the project just to be rejected. So I think it kind of stings a little bit better. But since I have not myself researched this to see the positive effects of doing it or the negative effects of doing it, I can't really speak to it. I will say I would not do it unless I really, really, really wanted to work for that company, especially being in HR. I feel like maybe certain industries I could see it being used more, like marketing, for instance, something along those lines. But that's all I have to say in regards to that.
Awesome, thank you. The next thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of the pipeline issue and how people will often say they can't find diverse talent because they're not in the pipeline. What do you think about this argument? And what do you suggest for companies that find themselves up against this problem? What can they really do to fix it? And we'll start with Amelia on that one.
Yes, I would say it's a pipeline issue because we make it a pipeline issue, in my personal opinion. I think going back to what we've discussed before, if you're only pulling from certain sources, if you're only taking in referrals from certain people, if you're only doing job searching through certain job boards, you're not going to campuses, especially where there are underrepresented people, you're not doing outreach in those types of areas or building relationships in those areas, then yes, you're going to have a pipeline issue. A great effort on us, the recruiters, the HR, the hiring managers, to look a little bit more into outreach into different areas. And then going back to what I said before, building a diverse network so that way you can reach out to different people.
Yeah, definitely.
I would, I think in a perfect world, we think of like sourcers, right? The sourcer role is somebody who is reviewing the inbound applications, someone who is reaching out on LinkedIn or Indeed or one of the other job boards. But I think we have to rethink that role, where it needs to be someone who is more proactive in reaching out to colleges, community colleges. What are some of the trade schools in the local area? There are workforce development that is required within each county, and looking at different sources and building, again, those relationships, but again, having that dedicated person just to create that candidate pipeline in that sourcer role is going to help that pipeline issue. Because when hiring managers say, oh, there's not enough candidates. Well, I've given you 10 candidates, but none of them were right. So let's go back to the drawing board and let's recalibrate. If they're complaining about pipeline and the types of candidates they're getting, then they're not drilling down on that job description. They're not getting the right candidate because that job description needs to be calibrated once again. So back to the drawing board, and it sounds like a waste of time, but I think ultimately long term, you need to make sure that there are very specific processes in place before you hit that post button.
Definitely. Whitney, thoughts about the pipeline issue? Okay. So we will head into our last question. Unless there's any more for the audience, feel free to throw those in the Q&A. And this question is for each of you to describe your ideal hiring process. So, we talked a lot about some of the different pieces, but if you were to put this all together, what do you think it would look like? And how would you, maybe communicate it to your candidates and communicate it to your hiring managers? How would that all look? And we'll start with Whitney on this one.
Oh, goody. Okay. So I definitely fully admit that the pipeline and the recruiting piece of it is usually before I get there. But I think, you all have made some wonderful points about making sure you're pulling from the right places. And campuses are not going to be enough, especially as Gen Z seeks college degrees at a lesser rate. With COVID, I know here in Kentucky, the community colleges were offering free 2-year degrees to anybody who graduated high school last year. So it's that bubble is bursting, and we're gonna have to really shift our paradigm there. However, once we get that pipeline, I would say, my process would be first having that really strategically defined list of traits or abilities or knowledge or skills that are truly critical to differentiate your top performers and your bottom performers. And going beyond the intuitive, right? We think we know what it takes to be a good salesperson or a good accountant, but oh my gosh, when you really start to drill down, it's fascinating what you find to be the real differentiators, whether it be for performing that job or being a good fit in the culture or whatever the case may be. So really spending the time on that piece is, I can't overstate that enough. And then once you've identified that list, let's find some objective ways to measure some of those things that really reduce that bias, so that we're not just relying on that face-to-face interview or some of the other processes that bring implicit bias into the picture, so that we can really kind of have those additional pieces of data to triangulate. I know a lot of discussion right now is going on around machine learning and AI, and there is still a ton of bias in those tools at this point. And so we need to be really careful about getting too quick in how we want to jump on that bandwagon and leverage those things. I think it comes down to having that well-trained interview team at that point that knows what they're trying to measure, that has some skills and some training in that area, because we can't replace the interview. I think that's still going to be an important point, and I would never argue that the assessments or some other things are there to replace that, but I think it's there to supplement. And so I think those would be kind of my 3 big pieces that I would love to see executed more effectively.
Awesome. Irene?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think regardless of the process, I think it's important for companies to slow down and really be thoughtful and intentional about what they're asking and what they're looking for. Too many times I've seen teams say, oh my gosh, so-and-so gave their 2-week notice. We've got to backfill. Let's hurry up and get that job description posted. I'll find the one that they applied to, but the job has changed. That person has changed that job even in the short time that they were there. So really peeling back the layers about what the job is about, who's going to be involved, who is involved in the process and the decision making, and then what are the steps throughout that process. Slow it down. Let's make sure that we're intentional about where we're getting our candidates. Every piece has to be thought of and rushing through these processes is the reason why there's not more underrepresented groups in companies. They're too eager to fill that seat because they're losing money with that seat open. But what they don't realize is that they're hiring the wrong person, and they're going to have to go through this process again, and turnover costs more than having that open seat. So they really have to look at slowing down this at each step of the process. I think that's really going to help them be more successful in their hiring practices.
Yeah, I'll say I agree with you on slowing down the process. What I think is funny is oftentimes the hiring managers are rushing the process, but then they're slow to respond too, right? So I see both, where it's like they're trying to make decisions quickly and not fully interview everyone, but then they take a week to tell you like who they've interviewed, what they want the next step to be. And so I think having that, like what Whitney said, having everything lined up of like, what is the process, knowing that ahead of time, because a lot of times HR, the recruiter, are waiting to hear the next step, and it takes several days, and there's just this lag time. So it's like slowing down, but also speeding up in responsiveness.
Yeah, I think it's fair to even go over the terms of engagement with them. You know, me as your recruiter or me as your business partner, you know, how do you want to be communicated to? How often should we speak? Are we meeting weekly to talk about the candidates that I've spoken to? Are you going to respond immediately after each interview? Like, drilling down that process, because at the end of the day, when they say, oh, I didn't hear from you, it's, well, these are the steps in engagement that you and I agreed to before we started this process. So I want to make sure that we're staying to this process.
Yeah. And Amelia, what is your ideal process?
Yeah, so I have a few words that I think of, right? So I think easy and transparent. I know that the hiring process, there's nothing easy about it. However, if the candidate can feel like it's easy, whereas, you know, I see a lot of times candidates like having to submit a cover letter, submit a resume, then turn around and put all of the information into the website for the ATS, right? They like convenience. They like things fast. They like to be able just to click, done, right? So also, I know that at least in California, we cannot ask what the salary range is for what a person is making, which I think is a good thing. However, I'm noticing some companies don't put the salary ranges either in their job descriptions. And some candidates are like, well, I don't even know if I want to apply because I need to make this certain amount to live. So I think making things on the candidate side easy and transparent with them, going back to what they already have said as far as what the job description actually is, like what they'll actually be doing and what they'll be compensated for. I think that's good. Within like the interview process, I think that there can be a greater amount of checks and balances, right? In my experience, I find that sometimes managers hire people that they like, right? So the skills, they have the resume to back it up because the resume is there, but going back to that bias, people like people that are similar to them, maybe not, even if it's not in look, but in personality, right? Extroverts seem to be attracted to extroverts. When it could be an introvert, that's extremely good. So I think finding a way to implement checks and balances where if everyone loves the candidate, you have a devil's advocate to kind of weigh the scales. I think that would be good. And then going back to what Irene said, the responsiveness, I wish that that was better in our hiring process. From the hiring managers to letting us know what's going on, but then also how we handle our candidates, because that the candidate experience is very important. And sometimes I know that they get ghosted on accident because our plates are so full. So I think those are like the main things that I would change with the hiring process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all those pieces. I think for me too, another thing I think about, and I'm curious to hear what any of your thoughts are on this, is an idea with the transparency piece of actually sharing the questions in advance with the candidate. I think that can be a really great way to like allow them to feel prepared and, you know, feel like they maybe ease the nerves a little bit going into an interview. What do you all think about sharing questions in advance with the candidate? Any thoughts?
I think that's a great idea. I think that it would help all candidates, start on the same playing field. People interview better than others. We've seen a lot of people who are fantastic interviewers, and then they get in the role and it's, gosh, this is the wrong person. We hired the wrong person. And I think it goes back to accessibility and underrepresented groups. Again, someone who was first generation college had to figure it out. I think it's important that if we give them the questions ahead of time, then they're going to answer based on what their experience is. It's going to be an honest answer, and they're prepared. And you're preparing all of the candidates equally, not just sharing the questions, but sharing the whole process. What does that whole process look like for them, and what can they expect?
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts on that?
I'm in between, to be honest.
Yeah, why?
I'm in between. I think it's great to ease the nerves of our candidates. I think it's a huge benefit. I know before interviews, I get extremely nervous. So if I had kind of a playbook to go by, I feel like that helps ease my nerves. But then I also think, to go back to what Irene said, you have people that are really good interviewers, right? So you give them the questions ahead of time, they're going to memorize it, right? Or if they're not good interviewers, you give some of the questions ahead of time, so they're going to their answers and they can come off as being super robotic. And if you have a bias against how a person speaks in that kind of way, I don't think it'll be good unless you're a really good interviewer, in my opinion. Because if you do sound not as strong in some of your answers, it could be like, well, hey, I gave these questions to you a week ago, and you don't know how to answer.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think that's on them too. I think that's on the onus of the candidate. If they have the questions ahead of time and they fail to prepare, then that as an interviewer tells me that they're not going to prepare for the role. How seriously are you taking this interview process? And I think there's a little bit of a telling behavior there.
I agree with you. I guess I hope I got my point across. I'm like, if you're a great interviewer, you're going to it. If you're not a great interviewer, it could not be as good for you. Also, I think you can be honest and not have the questions in advance, right? Because if you have the questions in advance, I don't think that's telling of honesty. Maybe Whitney can speak to that a little bit more. I feel like you can just craft your answers better, personally. But I'm not opposed to it either. Like, if I got them, I would love it ahead of time. Or if our company decided to do that, I wouldn't fight them on it, but I would say, hey, let's look at it from this angle too, like what's the data to support it. So hopefully Whitney can give us a little more insight if you.
Well, I think there's a happy medium. I think, absolutely being transparent about the process and what to expect, and maybe the types of questions that they're going to encounter and who they're going to be interviewing with. I absolutely think that is just fair to do. I do agree, though, Amelia, I think there's a higher propensity to strategically position yourself in a way, if the more preparation you have. Some people are innately able to do that on the fly, others aren't. But I think one kind of best practice I've heard about in interviews is for the interviewer to say, to ask a question and then say, feel free to take a minute to think about this before you respond. And so just, helping them, put them at ease and say, we're not expecting you to have this perfect answer on the fly, take a minute, and kind of normalizing that, I think maybe a little bit of a happy medium there.
Awesome. I love that. I think for me, the way I think about it, and I think when I have done this and provided the questions, I've given some of the questions in advance and then had some, where maybe it might be something you don't want them to look up in advance and make sure they actually have the knowledge. So kept those more secret. But I think the way I think about it is, if you're a company that's going to train someone to do their job and support them, you're sort of showing that in the interview by helping guide them through the process. So yeah, but I love all your opinions on it. Really great. So yeah, we're at our time. This conversation was so awesome. I'm so glad that I got to chat with all three of you about this. And I think everything you shared is really wonderful. So I'll just wrap up by saying that a recording of this webinar is going to be emailed to everyone within the next couple of days. And you can follow any of the awesome panelists on LinkedIn. So we have Amelia Badua from First Team, Irene Potsakis from Edelman, and Whitney Martin from Proactive Consulting. And then I'm Jocelyn Thompson from Work Vision Consulting. And if you are interested in learning more about WorkVision Consulting, you can find us online at workvisionconsulting.com. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest. If you're interested in a free discovery call, you can email info@workvisionconsulting.com. And we also just put out a free diversity, equity, and inclusion employee lifecycle tool that you can use to assess your DE&I efforts. And you can download that from our website, workvisionconsulting.com, at the resources page. So go check that out. It's really a fun and exciting tool. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So again, thank you so much to the panelists. I loved chatting with all of you, and thank you for everybody who joined us. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.